Dr. Jon Lieff, thank you so much for joining us here on the Science of Psychotherapy podcast. So great to see you.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here.
Now, as I said, as we were chatting before we started recording, to my shame, I hadn't seen this marvelous book of yours, The Secret Language of Cells, What Biological Conversations Tell Us About the Brain-Body Connection, the Future of Medicine, and life itself, such huge topics. But I have had a look at this book, and this is you're one of our people. I mean, we've been talking about the integration of brain, mind, body, for a lot of years, and this is a topic that is right up our alley. So really keen to get into the book. But before we do, I'm wondering if you'd like to just let our listeners know a little bit about your career. Which we could do a whole show on as well. I think you're like a David Attenborough of everything to do with communication in the natural world. So maybe you can just give us a little bit of insight into what that has been about.
You're right. Well, my medical career, which is many years, I worked in hospitals, hospitalized patients, complex patients. I created units that included medical, neurology, psychiatry, you name it. We had very complex cases trying to tease out, is it medical, is it psychiatric, is it neurological? So I was always wondering what the mind is and where it might be and what does the physical body have to do with it. And so that was a constant question in treating patients for many years. Brain injury program, I ran brain injury programs. Very involved in the elderly and geriatrics. And then about 10 years ago, I've always been interested in science. I lectured widely on neuroscience and psychopharm. But about 10 years ago, I started a website with the idea of trying to research online what is mind and where it might be in nature. And what I found is that the articles, neuroscience articles, are very, very confusing and complicated to most people at the hospital. People would say, do I speak a foreign language? And I would say, yes, I speak molecular biology. I speak molecular genetics. So I was basically take complex review articles and translate them into English each week. And this went on for years. And became apparent in my writings and readings that there is no module, there's no place for subjective experience. There's no center that they thought they could find or modules. Every cell is highly connected to all the other cells. And even though we measure in fMRIs, those are measurements in seconds, and the action is in milliseconds all over the brain. They say this center is active. Well, it's active in like 2 seconds, but meanwhile, the whole brain has been talking 1,000 times for milliseconds. So we just don't know. And it's funny, I'm not a businessman, but Harvard Business Review reviewed my book. I was shocked. And they were taken with the notion that the brain really is all the cells. It's really the body. Everything is talking and they're all communicating. But I began to investigate the brain. Then I was studying animals, and I had the honor to write some articles with Mark Bekoff, one of the great animal scientists. And I wrote about bees' brains and ants and termites and birds, and how amazingly intelligent these creatures are with tiny little brains. But then microbes, I began to write a lot about microbes and how incredibly smart they are, and how they build biofilms, they build civilizations, and even viruses we can talk about have signaling now. We've found that. I was writing about the lifestyle of viruses, and it appeared that they were part of the conversation that's going on between all the cells. But then I wrote about each kind of cell. I'd be writing about the gut cell and the cancer cell and the platelet and the blood vessel cell. And each one is extraordinarily intelligent, talking to its neighbors. And suddenly it dawned on me that I didn't see any books with this thesis. I looked around, and the reason why there is no books is it's just filled with jargon. You can't get, even if you're in one little area, like you're studying platelet cells, and Harvard Medical School featured my article on platelets, because platelets are much smarter than we thought. They're not just plugs. They're like first responders who attack the viruses. They call for other cells, and it became apparent to me that everything is happening with cells talking to each other, that nothing happens without communication back and forth, involving a lot of different cells. And it became apparent to me that that's where the action is. And when I looked around, there weren't any books with this thesis, because if you're researching, as I said, the capillary cell, in one down the hall, someone is researching the kidney cell, and if you read the journals, they're just gobbledygook filled with receptors and genes, and no one can make sense out of this. So I found translating them into English week after week after week for 10 years, it became apparent to me that I had to write a book about how everything in life, in biology, is based upon communication of cells, actually talking to each other. And I tried to write it so anyone could understand it. So one notable person said that even a high school science student could read it, any general science reader could read it. I eliminated all jargon. Some of the editors kept putting jargon in, I kept taking it out. And basically, I wanted it to be like a panoramic visual view of what it's like in the world of cells. And this one's talking to this one, and it became apparent that, Andy Weil called it a new paradigm, because a new paradigm for health and disease, because you can't now, if you want to study the kidney cell, you can't just study the kidney cell. You have to study all kinds of cells all over the body, how they're talking to each other. So I realized how incredibly integrated it is. And that's when I wrote the book. I mean, the most is known about the brain and the immune system, and we can talk about that. But I wrote about very obscure things like platelets and capillary cells determine what the organs, what they're going to build. Like they tell the stem cells what to do, which is who would have thought that? And who would have thought that platelets were intelligent and were first responders and called for different cells and could do things? Who would have thought that? But now the science is so good, they can look at these details.
Wow. So, and I'd love to get into some of those details in a second, but you've done this amazing job of translation, as you said, from gobbledygook to English, which is wonderful. And you've taken siloed areas of research and you've joined the dots together, right, so that we can have this big picture. Yeah, that's incredible. And you mentioned this as a paradigm shift. So in what areas of medicine and health, and we're talking also to a lot of psychologists here in mental health, what's going to be the forward impact of this paradigm shift? Well,
let me just give you, so one of the big things is the discovery in this science of signaling, of communication, is the discovery of what are called neuroimmune circuits, neuroimmune conversations. These are very important. I mean, this is just one conversation. I should talk about cancer. That's an amazing story, how they talk to each other like a colony and communicate, and like microbes. And we'll talk about microbes, like why are microbes so important? You read about them everywhere. And that's because they speak the same language as our cells, and therefore they can communicate. All the kingdoms of cells speak the same language. But probably the most research has been on the neuroimmune. And so let me give you an example. It used to be thought that there were no immune cells in the brain, and there really aren't. The microglia is there. The microglia is an immune cell, a macrophage actually, where in the fetus, it travels, all these fetus cells are traveling around. How do they know what they're doing? Anyway, travels into the brain area and then stays there and lives there for the rest of its life, and has children in one little discrete area, sort of watching out for and monitoring one particular area of neurons. Other than that, there aren't any immune cells in the brain unless something terrible is happening. But what we didn't know is that in the cerebral spinal fluid, which surrounds, we used to think it was just a cushion. And I deal with a lot of brain injury and, the effect of concussions. And of course it is a cushion, but it's vastly more than that. It's actually a river of signals and communication. It's a symphonic thing going. And there are cells that control making the cerebral spinal fluid, and they also regulate signals going back and forth from the blood into it. But we didn't know that there's 500,000 T cells. Now, T cells, with the chapter on T cell is very interesting. They're the master immune cells. They are, everyone reads about T cells, and because they're the ones that tell all the other immune cells what to do. And a lot happens in the first responders until the T cell gets there. T cell is the boss. It tells everyone what to do. And it can go after things much more specifically, and it helps make antibodies. It helps in everything. So we didn't know that there were 500,000 T cells floating in the cerebral spinal fluid. That was shocking. And what happened is that a T cell is sending signals into the neurons in the tissues of the brain, and it's telling, we get an infection, we have a flu, we feel sick. The T cell tells the neuron to create the sick feeling. So it's a signal, and so the neuron says, okay, we have to rest. So we get sick, we feel bad, we're tired, we lie down, and that helps us heal. And only the T cell can tell the neuron to stop this. And by sending a pulse, get back to normal cognition. And so normally the T cell is the one telling the neurons to keep cognition going in a normal way. And when it wants to stop, it sends a signal. That's just one of many. So it was also learned the fetus makes about 1 trillion cells, and then it prunes it down to a mere 80 billion. And then after birth, there's only about 1,000 a day. And it's been controversial how many, where, what, but most of them go to the nose to refresh the sensory data in the nose, which is so important. And the other goes to the memory center. And what happens is we lay down memories associated with, we don't know how a cell is associated with memory, just so we don't know how subjective experience relates to the brain, but they do seem correlated in some way. I view it as like a car. The memory is driving a vehicle or controller, like a TV, it's controlling it. Anyway, there are memories associated, and the new cells come about when we either learn new things or we re-remember things. So I always tell people to use, and of course, then when sleep occurs, the new memory what happens is they pull back on all the synapses and they emphasize the important ones at night. And then we can benefit from this reconsolidation of memory by taking a traumatic event, a traumatic memory, and re-remembering it, associating it to the new cell, and but adding a little bit of therapy, a little bit of love, a little bit of self-esteem, something that slightly changes the memory. Now, what happens is the old memory cell is still there, connected, still memory, but the new cell gradually is younger and stronger and takes over, and eventually it's kind of replaces it, and it becomes the dominant way that we remember. And we can keep doing that. We can keep chipping away at the trauma and lessening the overwhelming effect. Now, what is new is that, of course, that's new, but what also is new is that when depression occurs, from whatever cause, the T cell, like it tells the neuron to create the sick feeling, the T cell says, produce less memory cells. And we get this brain fog of depression, which everyone knows about. And so then when we cure depression through therapy, medication, shock treatment, walking in nature, jogging, whatever, what happens is the T cell starts telling the stem cells in the brain to go back to making neurons. The same happens with stress. Acute stress, you actually get better brain for a night or two while you're working on something. And then if it continues, it gets worse, the stress gets negative, and then we get the less and less cells and the brain fog. So this is the communication going, this is one example of 1,000 of going from the T cell to the neuron. Now going in the other direction, and by the way, I'm finding that neuroscience today is proving psychotherapy, is proving that it works.
Yes.
Because when drugs came in the 50s and 60s, basically everyone says, the hell with psychotherapy, it's all drugs, it's all biological, whatever that is, because everything is biological. And what we've learned now is the brain is constantly changing, building circuits here and there to the frontal lobes of the side. And what it's showing is the effect of using the mind on the structures of the brain. And I think and here's an example where psychotherapy creates new brain cells. It's showing it does that. And there are many ways that I'm really delighted, because I was one of the few psychiatrists that always worked with my partner, who is a psychologist, who did the therapies, and I did the medications and the sort of the overview, and the medical overview. But we worked always together for 30 years. And but of course, psychotherapy was harassed by insurance companies when this so-called biological vision came about, and now you can't separate them. And the new neuroscience is proving how psychotherapy is as good as any way to change the brain, like walking in nature is a way to change the brain. So here's an example of the other way, from neurons. We went from immune to neurons. Now neurons, so there are many ways that neurons can make any kind of inflammation, any kind at all. And we didn't know this, that neurons can make 30 different kinds of inflammation. So, and it can help inflammation. And as a matter of fact, we're finding pain circuits the pain chapter would be worth someone looking at, because it shows that there are these big, large synapses involving many more cells than it's not just a conversation of the neurons. It involves the astrocyte, the microglia, T cells, skin cells, gut cells, cancer cells, immune cells, all kinds of things. And they're huge synapses with 30 different signals going. And these are the basis of many just newly discovered chronic pain syndromes. And we're going to learn more about these synapses, which will help delineate many different chronic pain syndromes, highly related to immune, highly related to chronic symptoms, of fatigue and whatever, all these symptoms that people have. We're going to be learning about that through these complicated neuroimmune circuits. But just one example is meditation or relaxation, we know, works through the vagus nerve, and it calms the heart, and it calms the breathing, and it calms the gut. But we didn't know, how could meditation improve immunity? How could it trigger 250 genes and cytokines and signals? Well, we discovered that the neurons can influence immune cells and send immune signals. And lo and behold, the vagus nerve, that same meditative thing, is improving immunity in another section of the body. So down in the spleen, in the lymph nodes, it's creating immunity. Just one of many findings from this neuroimmune circuits, which are complicated. It's all not just neurons. They're called the neuron-centric view of neuroscience, which is really narrow. It's not going to win. It's not going to tell us what we need. These are broad circuits. Anyway, so the other one is with acupuncture. So no one has ever figured out how acupuncture works. And what's logical, it does work, but only symptomatically. You hit here and this happens, nausea, pain, et cetera. You can't get a diagnosis that makes any sense, but it does cause effects. So what happens is we don't know. You would think that it's a force of some kind you're affecting, and the forces in the West are blood flow and neurons. But there are many acupuncture points that aren't on either. So what's going on? Well, this was a great research that, and the research is getting so good, they can see cells and molecules. I mean, this is fantastic what they can see now in science. So you take this point in the wrist and you put the acupuncture and you stimulate it with electricity, and it's not near a neuron, and it's not near a blood vessel, but it causes an effect in the spleen. Well, what's going on? Well, it turns out underneath there is a T cell sitting there that the acupuncture point stimulates that immune cell, the master immune cell, who then travels a little bit, sends a signal to the neuron, it goes into the brain, and it goes down to the spleen. So again, these are just simple examples of a widespread phenomenon that is going to totally revolutionize, because depression is not one thing. Depression is 15 things, and a third of them are immune things. I mean,
yeah,
logically, you look at the symptom list, obviously, and the more and more research is showing that certain kinds of depression are associated with immune factors. Anyway, I've done a lot of blabbing, so
yeah, that's a lot to take in, and obviously we have to have this whole picture of how this whole system works. So one of the fascinating things that you point out, we've got a wired communication system and they've got a wireless communication system.
Right.
Now, I think a lot of people get the wired system because many of our listeners will be very familiar with the activity of neurons, but what we're probably not so familiar with, and especially talking about T cells, is this wireless communication network. Can you expand a little bit more on that?
Yes, well, we all learned in school that neurons talk to each other in circuits, and they send an electrical signal down an axon, which then triggers calcium, which then sends a little sac with a neurotransmitter to the next. But what we were not taught, and no one knew until recently, is that the neuron deliberately eliminates myelin in certain areas. Like in the cortex, there are all these fancy patterns of myelin not being there, and it's signaling sideways. It sends out an immune signal to immune cells sitting there next to the tissues, and that's one thing. It was not known how important sacs are, these little sacs surrounded by a membrane. Cells love to fill them with information molecules and send them. Neurons do that. They send these sacs. They also, cancer cells love these sacs. They're called exosomes. They put all kinds of information. They modify mitochondria and they send them to each other. Also, there are nanotubes. These are tiny little tubes that we've shown are used by, it's like an internet for microbes in the soil. They go the equivalent of thousands of miles, and they'll have one microbe eating a rock, eating some iron over here, sending electrons all the way, inches in the soil and helping all the other microbes getting food. They eat electrons along the way. But it turns out there's nanotubes between all of the cells. They're just too tiny, and we're just beginning to discover them. So, for example, between T cells, HIV use nanotubes to travel from one cell to the other without even going outside. They just go in the nanotube. Cancer cells use these to send they modify mitochondria, which is how they become so marvelously successful in multiplying and magnifying and growing. They take what the T cell does and magnify it. They are like master cells. They are highly intelligent cells. They communicate between their comrades. They send genes between each other, like microbes, to avoid our medications. They send genes to help fight off viruses that might be attacking them. They manipulate the signals of all the local cells and convince them to join them in building this structure that's abnormal. They make new blood cells that are abnormal. So back to the neuron. So the neuron has all these ways of communicating as well, and electricity. So the neurons vibrate and send electromagnetic information from one brain center to another. Like one frequency will say if you have a memory, like one frequency is where you were, and another frequency is what time it was in the memory. We're just learning about this, but more than that, there's a lot of electricity in the brain. You have all these neurons lined up. You have fields in between them, and we know that fields are important, like for building in the embryo. These gradient fields are how the embryo builds the brain to begin with. Not only that, but there are things called electrical synapses. Now, electrical synapses, we don't understand what this is, but basically these are connections sideways between two neurons, and it's just a free flow of electricity back and forth. It turns out that when the brain is built, everything is an electrical synapse first, and then the chemical synapses are built on the electrical synapses. So that happens also later in life. If you're going to rebuild something or a synapse or a new synapse, you may start with electrical. You may have a combination of both. We have no idea how the neuron knows what this electrical information is, but it surely does. because when you have you have an astrocyte malignant tumor in the brain, they're called astrocytomas. This very amazing cell that's extremely successful and deadly, basically it makes these electrical synapses with all kinds of neurons, and it's just stealing energy constantly. Like they steal energy from 60% of the neurons around them. They're just taking their energy and building the cancer. So neurons are communicating in at least 5-10 different ways, and we don't have a clue. Like when you talk about describing the brain based upon the circuits, it's kind of ridiculous, because you have the circuits, which are wonderful and a part of it, but then you have the astrocyte circuits that are just as complicated, that are necessary. And then you have all these other factors working. So to think you're going to describe how the brain works only through neuronal circuits is very, very narrow-minded, and it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. So that all these factors are going to have to be taken into place.
Yeah. So I'm familiar with astrocytes being kind of like a slow wave communication system, but it seems like it's even more complex than that. I've got to catch up, because I've just written about half a dozen questions. So back to nanotubes. Now, I'm familiar with nanotubes being within a cell, like in a neuron. I didn't realize that nanotubes were between cells. Is that what you're
talking
saying?
about by nanotubes in the neuron are not what I'm talking about. Nanotubes, those are microtubules.
Microtubules, sorry.
Well, they are nanotubes. They're tiny, very specialized. There are three kinds of scaffolding molecules that work. The microtubules are the highways that the motorized devices are bringing mitochondria, they're bringing material, they're bringing important stuff back and forth on the axon. Actin is at the end. Like if the microtubule is the highway, the actin is the local streets going on right near the delivery, the port where the neurotransmitter goes off. But what these are, they're like it. They are protein based. In other words, a microtubule is made out of a very particular kind of protein. Some people think the microtubule is the brain, is consciousness, because it could be a quantum computer. But this is speculative. I don't speculate actually in any of my writing. Or I made a vow. We know so much that we don't need to speculate. Actually, we're learning so much that I think I showed just through details that we cannot think of life as just a cell. We have to think about it as an intelligent cell. I don't think there's any question about that. So we're a huge composite of many, many different kinds of intelligent cells. But anyway, so the nanotube I'm talking about is external. And it can go a big distance, like it's like an internet for the microbes, but in the cancers, they have two kinds. One is a thicker kind that goes for a couple of days, and another is a thinner kind that goes for months. And they're sending molecules to their comrades and keeping their scene together. They're using the sacs to send out as a ship with all kinds of stuff that will start a metastasis, and they send it to certain faraway ports. Each tissue has a dialect of the conversations, of the signals, and some cancers know the dialect of the bone, the lung, brain. So when their sacs reach those places, they sit there for a while, they begin to communicate with the local cells, and they build a metastasis. They build a colony. So that's through sacs, not through nanotubes. Nanotubes are sort of closer to the action and near helping to build the structure and sending vital genes to fight viruses. It's a colony. It's an intelligent colony of cells working together. That's what we have to think of it as, or we're not going to understand it and defeat it. So, for example, most modern medicines are based upon the natural conversation. So there's a natural conversation of T cells trying to kill cancer cells because they're abnormal. We're supposed to get this cell. But cancer cells are so complicated because the cancer has 1,000 cells, and 5 different areas are subsets that have already made new mutations and are different. And so the T cell doesn't get this. It's attacking like it's a virus. It's one thing, and it make a major attack, and then it doesn't kill it. T cell doesn't know what to do. So now we're finding that they get exhausted. And so we're designing, it's called CAR-T, C-A-R-T. It's a type of thing genetically we alter the T cells so it'll last longer and fight the details of this. Each cancer is different, by the way. Every single person's cancer is, like you say, breast cancer, they're not the same. Everyone has a different set of mutations, as many as 40 or 50 mutations. And then you'll have a subset that has like 60 over here, and that's a different cancer. And you can kill all the cancer cells except for one stem cell. And that one stem cell will start it all over again.
Wow. Talking about cancer, it's just so many analogies pop up in my brain about politics, but we won't go there. But
politics has become a cancer, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's some quite literal connections to be made there. Why haven't we seen these nanotubes in the past? Are they just because they're so small? Right. Okay. Small.
Just, I mean, the science today is just fantastic. We have so many devices, and it's so, I mean, I talk about this, the fact and that fact. These take tremendous amount of effort and time of the, hundreds of thousands of scientists all over the world working on one little thing. But so I put it together, but I can't do anything without all these scientists doing it. And the devices are getting so amazing that we can see down to DNA and how we need 30 proteins talking to each other in order to start a protein. I mean, it's just fantastic what we're learning. But the nanotubes are going to get bigger and bigger, more important. And it's not clear what they do with neurons at this moment. Right. They have to be there because they've been described and they're everywhere. And they've been very, very carefully observed and documented in cancer cells and in microbes. And I'm sure they're almost everywhere.
I was taken by Stuart Hameroff's theory of, quantum communication through the microtubules.
You were captured by it.
I was captured by it. But it's like you said, it's speculation.
Speculative. I love Roger Penrose. I love the theory, but it's speculative. We don't know. We do know that the current science does not include subjective experience, so it's ridiculous. In other words, to have a science, and a lot of these scientists and psychologists want to say, because we don't have a science proving it, it doesn't exist. There's no such thing as subjective experience, which you and I and everyone knows is nuts. So to have a science that can say nothing about the most important thing in our lives, and what we obviously know is real, it's going to have to change. There's going to have to be a new kind of science that includes subjective experience and consciousness in physics. It has to be in physics, and and quantum is part of it. And my next book is going to be about orbitals and how molecules are communicating, as well as chemical reactions, and how all this. In my book, I talk about cells. There's a section on the body cells. I had to separate it somehow to talk, and then the brain cells, then the microbe world and viruses, and then the organelles, the mitochondria, smaller and smaller. The very last chapter, I threw a teaser in. I put a molecule, an enzyme, a protein that seems to communicate like it's a cell. And so that's my next book, is to show how this intelligent communication is not just cells. It's actually deeper. It's actually deeper in the molecules and in the chemical reactions.
Right. Yes. I was going to say, as we continue to talk, we're getting on the smaller and smaller level, and there's at the foundation there has to be a common communication. You talk about the sharing of electrons, photons in terms of communication.
Everything is based on electrons, as far as we know. I mean, every gadget we're using, this Zoom presentation, it's an electron traveling, going through a motor, going through a computer, doing things, and then continuing on. The electrons go in the mitochondria, they produce energy, they create the protons, they create ATP. Electron produce all the chemical reactions that create the DNA to begin with. So that's what I'm grappling with for my next book. But I'm actually going to go from human to superhuman, internet, interpersonal, down to animal cells, down to embryos, then to cells, then to the cascade of way that cells work inside, down to the DNA, and then down to the actual chemical reactions. I want to show that all of these levels have communication as their basis.
Wow. Wow. You must have a good grasp of the fabric of life, which in the subtitle of your book, you speak about, life itself. Are these philosophical musings, or are you still, just presenting the science?
Very, very specific.
Mhm.
I don't speculate. That is the last chapter. There's a little speculation, but basically, right now, it's impossible to define life. Carl Zimmer has a wonderful book about that, how you take every definition of life from a scientist and it just doesn't make any sense. So you say, well, it involves reproduction. Well, I'm past reproduction. Am I dead? I mean, I'm not reproducing now. Old people don't reproduce. A neuron doesn't reproduce. Is it alive? Well, obviously. So he takes every single definition of life, and none of it makes any sense. There are the ways that viruses, are they alive? Of course they're alive, but they're not alive. Well, they are alive in the same way. People don't really understand that what they're calling the virus is really a spore. It's really hibernating. The virus is when it comes into the cell and takes over the cell and builds a factory in the cell and actually dominates the cell. And how can that little tiny thing with HIV has like 9 genes, Ebola has 7 genes. How can 7 genes take over this huge T cell that has thousands and thousands of proteins and genes and mechanisms? Yet it does. And it creates a room where it builds a factory. That's when the virus is alive. And then when it's traveling, it's just a spore. But the bottom line is right now, where science is at, life is defined as a cell that has metabolism, can reproduce, and maybe some other things. That's it. I feel, if you read my book, it's very clear that it has to also include not just a cell, but an intelligent cell that's talking to other cells. Now, how does a cell in one part of the body know to talk to a cell, in the other part of the organ or far away? How does it know this? Well, we don't have any idea, but it is doing that. That's what's happening. I'm not speculating on how we know, but it is doing that. So that is, the definition of life has to be broadened at least that much from the current information that we have.
Yeah. It's absolutely fascinating. There's something like a virus, which is generally considered a non-living thing, has a kind of a wisdom about it, that it can
I write about viruses a lot on my website. I wrote articles about HIV, about Ebola, about varicella, dengue, and I have a chapter in my book that also includes a little bit about COVID. Yep. What we have to understand, so we knew that microbes send signals 30 years ago, but they were too small. You couldn't figure it out. And yet, and we gradually learned how important microbes are in our lives. I mean, here in the gut, you have trillions, you have 300 times more DNA making products than our cells. They're making hundreds of times more products than we're making, and a lot of them are important. So, and the reason, of course, that they can be influenced is because they speak the same signals. But about 4 years ago, it was discovered that viruses signal. I always thought they did, but I didn't say they did because I didn't have evidence. But what I did do is I described their lifestyle. So I said, well, it's a very complicated lifestyle. How do they do this if they're not signaling? Turns out we found the signal, the first one, about 4 or 5 years ago now. And now there are at least 15 whole languages involving all kinds of cells. Now we're finding that viruses are building structures that are like biofilms, they're cooperating, they're communicating. So viruses are part of the picture.
What's the mechanism of communication? What's the channel?
Same thing, little molecules.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, little molecules and receptors, just like cells. Like they'll send a little molecule that'll say, let's all get together and decide whether we should kill this bacteria. If we had enough of it, we'll move on, or do we let it live and continue to eat off this, live off this bacteria? And they make a decision based upon, that's called quorum sensing in microbes. We've known about that for 20 years, but now it's true with viruses, now what viruses are, they're everywhere. They are the catalog, they are the Wikipedia, they are the repository of all knowledge. They are the repository of all DNA strands. They have vastly more DNA strands than all other creatures put together, including all the microbes. There are more of them than there are stars in the sky. It's vast. And these viruses are constantly sending information, changing, going here, going in and out of cells. Cells use them to send signals. They're transferring resistance genes to their favorite bacteria. They're fighting against the enemy of their favorite bacteria. They're helping our cells. But even more than that, if you look at our DNA, human DNA, 2% less, 2% is what we call our genes. 8% are from retroviruses that are in our DNA, and they make the placenta. They make the syncytium molecule that you wouldn't have as placenta. They also make all kinds of stuff for stem cells, for the brain. One of the reasons the human, and it's mostly in human cells, there's all this jumping genes going on. The more sophisticated a brain is, the more there are jumping genes and these retroviruses. So someone won the Nobel Prize recently for changing one cell into another and making it into a stem cell by taking what they call transcription factors. These are proteins that are necessary to make things happen in the genes. And you have to do certain genes that will make a cell go back to a stem cell. They got that information from the retrovirus DNA that's in the human cell. So that comes as a gift from the virus. Also, the amylase enzyme is a gift from viruses. The placenta is a gift from the virus. Now, that's just this 8%, 50% of our DNA. So basically, 2% is real genes, 8% are retrovirus, maybe 30% create only RNAs that are important for everything, regulation and signaling. 50% are virus-like strands called jumping genes. Wow. 50%. And they're moving around and they're active. And those are very important for evolution of the human brain and for alternative splicing. So DNA viruses are not, they're vital to, they're part of us. They're vital to our existence. They can be extremely positive and very negative, as we know. I mean, the problem is you can't go running around destroying habitats willy-nilly without paying attention to the fact that a virus that's been quite happy living off a bat for 1,000 years is suddenly, I say, oh, here's a human. This is great. I'll jump to the human, see if I can make it. And if they make it, hey, this is great. I'll move to the next one. And sure enough, we have COVID. By the way, there's no way a human could have designed the spike like they're talking about. As a matter of fact, Zimmer described a study recently done in a totally different part of the world in Southeast Asia, where they found 3 bats with coronaviruses, almost exactly like COVID, with the spike. So it is our, sadly, abusing the environment like so many things, so many things are today. It's a sad state of affairs.
Wow, that is so amazing, and you cover viruses in your book, and I'll point people to your website as well. Obviously, there's a wealth of information. You've been translating science for us for a long time, so you must have a great archive of material there. Well, Dr. Lieff, this is overwhelming, the information that you've got here, and I am so appreciative that you've been able to translate into English for all of us to understand, and we'll definitely be pointing people to your book. But what I would love to do in the future is to bring you back, and maybe we can just hone in on some specific details and just just go a little bit deeper, because I'm very aware that we've kind of just skimmed the surface today in the time.
Yeah, we didn't talk a lot about how to use the brain and how and neuroplasticity. We really should talk about neuroplasticity.
Yes, but I think
I'd love to.
This has been a good primer anyway for people to get into your material. Dr. Jon Lieff, thank you so much for joining us here on the Science of Psychotherapy podcast, and looking forward to speaking with you more in the future.
Thank you so much for having me.